Well, hello random YouTube people. I'm assuming you clicked on this video because you have a RZR and you noticed in your front end you saw a cover that has a tear in it. Well, that's called the steering rack boot, and in this video that's what we're going to replace. It's super simple. Stay tuned. Subscribe. Well, we just picked up a new RZR and I didn't notice this until I turned the steering wheel all the way to the right, but there's a tear in the steering rack boot. It's not that intimidating, though it might look like it. It's just held on by a couple of zip ties, and we just have to take the tie rod end off. Let me show you how to do this. It's super simple. I headed over to good old Amazon and I typed in the year, make, and model of my machine, and I found this, and I will post a link to this in the description in hopes that it will help you find yours. But you'll notice that these boots have two different ones. There's a driver's side and a passenger side, and it's really important that you put the right one on. In this case, it's on our driver's side, so I need the shorter, fatter one, not the one that has the long, skinny column. I also picked up some Lucas Red and Tacky grease. We're going to use this to cover the rack and pinion before we put the boot back on, just so that we replace the grease that was there that might have been lost. So let's get to it. You can do this without having to lift your machine up with floor jacks. You can just turn the steering wheel all the way to the passenger side in my case, which will expose where the tie rod meets the wheel. So this steering rack boot, like we've been talking about, is connected to the steering rack. Connected to it is the tie rod. The tie rod is what connects to the wheel, and this is how you turn your machine to the left and to the right. All we really need to do is take off this 19mm bolt. Let's go get our socket wrench. Just to be safe, going to put some wheel chocks on the back wheels of the RZR. Now with our 19mm deep socket, we're going to loosen up this nut. And there we are. Make sure you don't lose this nut. And now all you have to do is grab the tie rod and pop it off of the wheel. In order to get the old boot off and the new boot on, we need to first take off the tie rod end. We're going to do that by loosening this tension nut. I'm going to first take a marker and mark where the tension nut is sitting right now on the threads so I know how far to go back. This is to help with the alignment. Now with a pair of crescent wrenches, I'm going to hold one crescent wrench onto the tie rod itself so it doesn't spin, and then I'm going to use the other crescent wrench to spin off the tie rod end. With the tie rod end off of the tie rod, we're going to take off the tensioning nut as well. Now we need to take the clamp off the end of the boot. You can do this with screwdrivers, or I have this really cool auto trim removal tool that has two ends on it, and it made short work of this. Once detached, just slide this off the tie rod and do not lose it. We are going to reuse it. The last thing that is holding this boot in place is a simple zip tie. You can see me underneath the RZR. I'm grabbing my pliers and I'm finding the zip tie on the other end of the boot, and I'm just going to snip it so we can pull this off. And just start pulling the boot off. Now comes the part where we put the new boot on. Before we do that, let's clean up some of the old grease off of this rack and pinion section so that we can put new grease on. We want to get rid of all of the dirt buildup that might have been collected because of the crack in the boot. Let's just clean it off and put on some more Lucas Red and Tacky grease. Starting with the ball joint, just putting in a hefty amount of this grease in there and making sure I move the ball joint around to get the grease all around the ball. Then I'm going to take the Red and Tacky and also put it in the actual rack and pinion section. You can see I'm just lathering it up here. Then I'm going to spin the wheel so that the rack goes back in, and then I'm going to spin it out and put some more grease on, and then repeat that process a couple of times just to make sure that the rack section is nice and lubricated. Now at this stage I wanted to reiterate the importance of which boot you put on. The short and fat boot is usually for the driver's side because that's the closest one to the actual steering column. This one that has the long and skinny section, kind of looks like a turtleneck, is for the passenger side. You can also compare with the one that you just took off. Now you might want to replace both at this stage, and if you want to, go for it. I'm just going to replace the one that is torn. To make the boot easier to slide on, I'm going to spray it with this water-resistant silicone lubricant from WD-40. I'm also going to start the zip tie on the end that's going to connect to the steering column. That's going to make it easier for me to just put this straight on and tighten the zip tie rather than having to try to run it over while it's in there. With a little bit of persuasion, this boot will slip right on the shaft. That's what she said. Of course, make sure you put the steering rack end on first. That's the bigger opening, and the other one with the smaller end will be on the tie rod side. Now to make this easier, of course, I have the rack open all the way to the driver's side, which means I've turned the steering wheel all the way to the passenger side. That's going to make it so that this boot doesn't stretch and we have nice room to get this put on here on both sides. Now just working on the steering rack end of the boot over the steering rack opening itself. I have some grease on there, so I'm going to try to wipe that up a little bit, make it easier. But once it's on here, you just simply tighten your zip tie until it's nice and snug. Now I got a better shot of this before, so I'm going back to other footage, but you can see this little collar piece on the tie rod part. We want to make sure that the boot is on the other side of this collar so that when we clamp down the clamp, it doesn't move past this little collar piece. So it actually needs to be on the other side of this little collar piece, so that it looks like this. Now put back on the little collar clamp that we took off earlier with our screwdrivers, and then we're going to just squeeze that back together and maybe even grab some pliers to squeeze that back together so it's nice and tight. Now for the tie rod end, we're going to reverse the process of how we took it off. We're going to first put on that tension nut. And I'm stopping that tension nut right where I drew that line with the permanent marker. That's as far up as it was, so I don't want to go up any further than that or I'm going to throw off my alignment. And now spinning on that tie rod end. Now I'm not tightening down the tension nut yet. I'm going to make sure it slips onto the wheel itself before I tighten that down. Now just placing the tie rod end in that hole on that wheel that we took it off from earlier. And just making sure it sits nice and snug in that hole before we spin on the nut. Now just a word of advice, do not try to put Loctite on the nut that's on this tie rod end. You're going to have a heck of a lot of trouble trying to get the nut spun on if you try to do Loctite. It's not a good idea. Just spin it on like it came off. In all the service manuals and things that I could find online, it recommends that you tighten this down to about 30 foot-pounds. And that is all. We are done. Now go enjoy your razor. Thank you so much for watching. If you found any part of this video helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with all of your friends, give me a comment, and be sure to subscribe. Subscribe. If you want to watch more of my videos, just search for my name. DIY BRY. Yeah!